In the summer of 1967, a 13-year-old boy from a dusty barrio in the Philippines stepped onto a stage in a provincial capital. He was wearing a pair of borrowed shoes 3 sizes too big and a shirt his mother had sewn from a flour sack. When the music started, a U.S. Navy officer in the audience dropped his glass. Within 3 minutes, that boy had done something that would make the American military base in the Philippines grind to a complete halt, and would force the most powerful record executives in Los Angeles to charter a private plane to a country most of them couldn't find on a map. But before they arrived, a secret was exposed that threatened to destroy him. This is the story of Victor Cruz, the boy they called the future Elvis. The air in Olongapo City was thick with the smell of frying bananas and the distant sound of rock and roll drifting from the gates of the U.S. Naval Base. In 1967, the American presence in the Philippines was massive, and with it came a cultural invasion of jukeboxes, blue jeans, and the unmistakable voice of Elvis Presley. In a small nipa hut on the outskirts of the city, that voice was the only escape for a painfully thin boy named Victor Cruz. His family was so poor that electricity was a luxury, so Victor would spend his evenings outside the homes of wealthier neighbors, pressing his ear against the wooden walls, listening to the faint, tinny sound of Elvis singing "Heartbreak Hotel" or "Hound Dog" on their transistor radios. Victor was a scrawny kid, the kind that got overlooked. He helped his mother wash clothes for the American officers' wives, and his hands were often raw and red from the lye soap. But in the quiet moments, he would open his mouth and mimic the sounds he heard. He didn't understand the English words perfectly, but he felt them. He felt the swagger, the pain, the raw energy. He would practice for hours in front of a cracked piece of mirror, using a stick as a microphone, trying to curl his lip just like Elvis, trying to get his legs to shake with that same hypnotic rhythm. His mother, Imelda, saw the fire in him. She was a devout woman who worried about her son's obsession with this American devil music, but she also saw the only spark of joy in his otherwise hard life. So, when she heard about a talent contest at the base theater, a contest with a grand prize of 500 pesos, a fortune that could feed their family for months, she made a decision. She went to the local market and traded her only pair of good shoes for a bolt of cheap, white, shiny fabric. She stayed up for 3 nights, sewing by the light of a single candle, crafting a makeshift jumpsuit inspired by the photos of Elvis she'd seen in an old magazine an officer's wife had thrown away. The problem was the shoes. Victor had none that weren't falling apart. On the day of the contest, he walked to the stage barefoot, carrying his mother's creation in a bag. Backstage, he was a mess of nerves. The other contestants were older, confident, some in real store-bought outfits. They laughed at his flour sack shirt. But then a young Filipino-American sailor, a teenager himself named Junior, saw the fear in Victor's eyes. He saw the homemade costume and understood. Without a word, he took off his own black leather loafers and pushed them toward Victor. They were enormous on him, but Victor laced them up tight, stuffing the toes with newspaper. He looked ridiculous, a scarecrow in a shiny suit and clown shoes, but he stood a little taller. When his name was called, the theater, filled mostly with off-duty American servicemen and their dates, was noisy and indifferent. Victor walked to center stage, the 2 big shoes slapping against the wood. Someone in the back laughed. The band, a local group who barely knew the song, struck up the opening chords of Blue Suede Shoes. Victor closed his eyes for a second. He saw his mother's tired face. He saw the mocking eyes backstage. And then, he opened his mouth. He didn't just sing the song. He became it. The voice that came out of that scrawny frame was not a copy, it was a detonation. It had the same rich, resonant tone as Elvis, but with a raw, desperate edge that came from a life of true hardship. He forgot the shoes were too big. He forgot the audience. His legs began to move, a wild, uninhibited shake that was more punk rock than rockabilly. He dropped to his knees, his voice cracking with emotion on the high notes, and the audience, which had been laughing, was now frozen. A sailor in the front row dropped his bottle of San Miguel beer, the glass shattering on the floor, but no one looked. They were all staring at the apparition on stage. As Victor hit the final, soaring note, holding it until the band stumbled to a halt behind him, there was a single second of absolute silence. Then, the theater erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar. Men were standing on chairs, whistling. Women were crying. It was a chaos of disbelief. The U.S. Navy officer who had dropped his glass, a Captain Reynolds, was already on his feet, pushing his way backstage. He didn't care about the contest. He saw something else, a ticket to fame and fortune, not for himself, but for this boy. Victor won the contest easily. Captain Reynolds found him backstage, still trembling, still clutching the makeshift microphone. The captain, a man with connections to the USO and a brother who worked for a small record label in Los Angeles, made Victor a promise. He would get him on a USO tour. He would get him seen by real Americans. The story of the Filipino Elvis spread through the base like wildfire. Within a week, Victor was performing on the base itself, in front of thousands of servicemen. The response was the same. It was pandemonium. A reporter from the military newspaper, The Stars and Stripes, wrote a piece about him with a headline that would define his life: "They call him the future Elvis." The article was picked up by wire services and made its way back to the United States. The hype was instant and enormous. Back in LA, a man named Seymour Stein, a young and ambitious promoter who had just started his own label, saw the article. He knew a phenomenon when he saw one. If this kid was half as good as they said, he could be bigger than Elvis. He could be the next big thing, but with an exotic twist that would drive the girls wild. Stein didn't hesitate. He chartered a private plane to the Philippines, a journey that took almost 2 days, to find this boy and sign him before anyone else could. Meanwhile, in Olongapo, Victor's life had become a whirlwind. He and his mother were moved into a guest house on the edge of the base. People brought them food, clothes, money. For the first time in his life, Victor slept in a real bed. Captain Reynolds became his de facto manager, coaching him on how to talk to Americans, ironing out his rough edges. The pressure was immense, but Victor was a boy who had known nothing but pressure his whole life. He thrived. The day Seymour Stein arrived, it was an event. He came with a lawyer, a photographer, and a contract. He watched Victor perform a short set for the sailors, and his eyes gleamed with dollar signs. This was it. This was the goldmine. After the show, in a private room at the base officers club, Stein laid the contract on the table. It promised a recording session in Nashville, a national tour, and more money than Victor could comprehend. It was the American dream, handed to him on a silver platter. Imelda, Victor's mother, sat quietly in the corner, clutching a small wooden cross. She couldn't read the English in the contract. She just watched her son's face as he looked at the future. Captain Reynolds was smiling, already planning his own role in Victor's success. Stein was pushing a pen toward the boy. Victor picked it up. His hand was shaking. This was the moment he had dreamed of under the stars, listening to music through a stranger's wall. But then, the door to the room burst open. A Filipino journalist, a young, serious-looking man from a local newspaper, pushed his way past the guards. He was holding a stack of papers and a determined expression. He ignored Stein's protests and walked straight to the table. He looked at Victor, then at Captain Reynolds, and then he laid the papers down. "What are you doing?" Stein barked. "This is a private meeting." The journalist, whose name was Rico, pointed a finger at Victor. "He is a fraud," he said, his voice loud and clear. "Not a performer. A fraud. A trick." The room went cold. Victor felt the pen slip from his fingers. His mother gasped. Rico explained, pointing to the papers, which were medical records he had obtained from a small clinic in Olongapo. For years, he revealed, Victor had been suffering from a severe case of St. Vitus dance, a neurological disorder that causes uncontrollable muscle spasms. The shaking, the wild movements that everyone thought were his brilliant imitation of Elvis, were actually involuntary spasms caused by a high fever he had as a child. The boy had a condition that made him shake. He had just learned to control it, to ride it, to time it with the music. The voice, the raw emotion, that was his. But the dance, the very thing that made him look like Elvis, that was a symptom of a disease. The silence in the room was suffocating. Captain Reynolds turned pale. Seymour Stein stared at the boy, his dream of a new Elvis crumbling into dust. A gimmick was one thing, but a performer with a neurological disorder was a risk, an unknown. The American market was cruel. They would call him a freak, not a star. Stein stood up. He looked at Victor, not with anger, but with the cold disappointment of a businessman who had just discovered his investment was worthless. "I'm sorry, boy," he said quietly. He picked up his contract, tucked it into his pocket, and walked out of the room without another word. His lawyer and the photographer followed. The door clicked shut behind them. Captain Reynolds tried to speak, but no words came. He just looked at Victor, then at the floor, and then he too left, his dreams of managing a star evaporating in the humid air. Victor and his mother were left alone with Rico, the journalist who had just destroyed their lives. Imelda was weeping, a soft, broken sound. Victor felt the shaking start again, the real shaking, the one he couldn't control. He had just been exposed as a fraud, but he had never claimed to be an imitator. He was just a boy who loved to sing, and his body moved the only way it knew how. Rico sat down across from them. He looked at the weeping mother and the trembling boy. He had expected to expose a con man, but looking at Victor now, he saw only a child. He saw the homemade jumpsuit, the two big shoes. He saw the truth. "I'm sorry," Rico said, his voice softer now. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it was a trick to fool the Americans." Victor finally spoke, his voice a whisper. "I never meant to fool anyone. When the music plays, the shaking, it feels right. It's the only time it feels right." Rico sat with them for a long time. He heard the whole story, the years of poverty, the hours listening at windows, the desperate hope. He saw the raw, undeniable talent that existed separate from the physical condition. He left the guesthouse that night a changed man. He had come to bury a star, but instead, he had found a story far more compelling than any imitation. The next morning, Rico wrote a new article. It wasn't an exposé of a fraud. It was a profile of a boy, his struggle, his truth. He wrote about street Vitus dance, explaining the condition with compassion. He wrote about the poverty, the homemade suit, and the borrowed shoes. He wrote that Victor Cruz wasn't trying to be Elvis. He was just a boy from the Philippines who sang with the soul of an angel and moved to a rhythm only his body knew. The article hit the streets of Olongapo and Manila like a bombshell. The American sailors on the base, who had felt momentarily duped by the exposé, read Rico's new story. They remembered the raw emotion of his performance. They didn't care about the diagnosis. They cared about the feeling he gave them. A groundswell of support began. It wasn't about the future Elvis anymore. It was about Victor. The story was picked up by a wire service again, but this time, it was a different story. It was a human interest piece about courage and authenticity. An Associated Press reporter in Manila saw it and wrote a new version that was published in small papers across the American Midwest and the South. The headline read, "Boy with shaking disease, stuns crowds with soulful voice." The reaction in America this time was not from slick record executives in Los Angeles. It came from the people. Letters began to pour into the U.S. Embassy in Manila, addressed to Victor Cruz. They contained money, sometimes just a dollar bill, sometimes 20. They contained notes of encouragement, stories from other people with similar conditions, offers of help. They came from a grandmother in Ohio who had arthritis, a teenager in Texas with cerebral palsy, a preacher in Alabama who saw the hand of God in the boy's story. Seymour Stein, sitting in his LA office, saw the new wire reports. He saw the public's reaction. He was a businessman, and he recognized that this new narrative was not a liability, it was the most powerful marketing campaign money couldn't buy. He tried to get back in touch with Captain Reynolds, but the captain, humiliated, had distanced himself. So Stein called the U.S. Embassy himself. But it was too late. Victor and his mother had moved back to their nipa hut. The money from the contest was gone, spent on debts and a proper pair of shoes for Victor. They were poor again, but something had changed. Victor was no longer hiding. He would sit on his front step and sing, not caring who heard. The neighborhood children would gather, and sometimes, the American sailors from the base would drive their jeeps out to the dusty road just to park and listen to him sing under the stars. One of those sailors was Junior, the boy who had lent Victor his shoes. He was being shipped back to the States, but before he left, he made a promise. He told his story to his family, and his family told their church. The chain reaction continued. 6 months later, a representative from a major television network in New York arrived in Olongapo. They weren't there to sign a record deal, but to offer something else, a spot on a national TV show in America, not as a singer, but as a guest. They wanted to tell his story. They wanted him to sing one song, just one, to show the world. Victor, now 14, stood on a soundstage in New York City, wearing a simple, dark shirt and trousers. There was no jumpsuit, no borrowed shoes. He was just himself. The host of the show introduced him, telling the story of the boy from the barrio, the misunderstood movements, the power of his voice. The American audience, millions of them, watched with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Then Victor began to sing. He chose a simple, Filipino folk song, a song his mother used to hum while she worked. It was a song of longing and hope, and he sang it in his native tongue. His body began its familiar, uncontrollable shake. The camera zoomed in. There was no trick, no imitation. It was just him. The raw, pure emotion in his voice, the vulnerability in his trembling form, was devastating. It was the most authentic performance of music ever seen on that stage. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, just like in that small theater in Olongapo. Then, the studio audience rose to its feet. They weren't cheering for a novelty act. They were cheering for a boy who had transformed his greatest weakness into his most powerful expression. They were cheering for the truth. Victor didn't become the next Elvis. He didn't become a global rock and roll sensation. But he did something more important. He went back to the Philippines and used the modest fame and the money that did eventually come from a small, independent label to open a small music school in Olongapo for children with disabilities. He taught them that their differences were not chains, but the very things that could set them free. He never stopped shaking, but he never stopped singing, either. And in the hearts of those who heard his story, the boy they once called the future Elvis became something far more lasting, a symbol of unbreakable spirit, proving to the world that the most beautiful music often comes from the most unlikely places, carried on a voice that trembles not with fear, but with life itself. Thank you for listening to the incredible story of Victor Cruz. Before you go, we would love to know where in this vast and beautiful country you are watching from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city and state. We read every single one.